Greetings to all and welcome. Today it is swelteringly hot, and today I have a new pair of anti-reflective glasses. In other news, as I vaguely suggested in my last video, I've decided that I'm going to begin posting videos every so often, perhaps more frequently than every so often, in which I respond to some of the thoughts of other thinkers out there, and in particular, people whose positions radically differ from my own. That's right, friends, I'm on the lookout for people who think that my entire worldview is balderdash and nonsense. And I thought, just to get the ball rolling on this one, I might go straight for the antipode. I set out with the simple idea of finding a video which laid forth some of the primary arguments in favor of atheism. And I had a few criteria by which I was going to choose amongst the variety of videos that I was likely to find. The maker of said video had to be intelligent, articulate, able to express his views in a sensible and rational way. He had to be knowledgeable, both about his own atheistic position and about the Christian position to which he was responding. He had to be respectful and fair when dealing with views divergent from his own, and it wouldn't help if he were at least reasonably presentable. In short, I was looking for the kind of person that I'd enjoy sitting down at a table with a cup of tea to talk these matters over person to person. Turns out on the internet it's not easy to find people like this. But to my great good luck, I happened to stumble across one Alex O'Connor. Mr. O'Connor is just about as firm-footed an atheist as one can find, but he's also precisely my kind of thinker. And I'd just like to begin by complimenting you, Mr. O'Connor, on your presentation, your equilibrium, your level-headedness, and your reasonableness. Now, a word about the video that I'm about to make. This is actually a response video to a video which is responding to another video. That's right, it's a response video to a response video. And I was wondering if we might just keep the ball rolling on this one. What do you say, Mr. O'Connor? How about a response video to a response video to a response video? Shall we see just how meta we can get with this one? It seems pretty unlikely that a thing like that would ever happen, but you know, I'm a Christian, so I'm not unaccustomed to long shots. Speaking of length, Mr. O'Connor's original video is itself fairly long, so I anticipate that my video will also be fairly long. In order to put some reasonable limits on this, I will be concentrating on those arguments of Mr. O'Connor's which I find to be the most challenging and important to my worldview. I will be leaving out a lot of the material in Mr. O'Connor's original video. Anyone who's interested in seeing it can take a look at the description below, and you will find a link there. For the purposes of clarity and coherency, I will be including the relevant pieces of the original video to which Mr. O'Connor is responding, a video by one Redeemed Zoomer. So, without further ado...
A new, fast-growing Christian YouTube channel, Redeemed Zoomer, put out a video promisingly called All Atheist Arguments Answered in 10 Minutes. Let's see how he does.
Atheists have a lot of arguments, but they never really think of anything new that the church hasn't had answers to for the past 2,000 years. So let's answer them. Religion causes wars. Well, actually, only 7% of all human wars were caused by religion, and if you remove Islamic wars, that number drops down to 3%.
Right off the bat, this isn't really an argument for atheism, just for the idea that religion is harmful. Even if religion caused no wars at all, that's no actual evidence that any religion is true. Still, even if religion only causes 7% of wars, isn't it a problem that it causes any wars?
But is this a problem? Is it really? And why? So I agree with Mr. O'Connor that this is actually not a very important question if we're considering it to referee in some manner the dispute between atheism and Christianity. If Christianity had caused the majority of wars throughout human history, that would not disprove it. If it had caused no wars, that would not prove it. But Mr. O'Connor doubles down on the point and suggests that it's actually a problem that Christianity caused any wars whatsoever. But why? Looked at from a certain perspective, we could say that all wars, 100% of them, are produced by politics. If you were just to leave out people's pesky political motivations and commitments and ideas, then there would never be any war whatsoever. Are we going to say that this produces some kind of theoretical problem for politics? I mean, there are some who claim such a thing, the anarchists, for example. Other motivations for wars include things like money, property, love. Let's not forget the face that launched 1,000 ships, nor is that the only example which could be adduced. Now, are we going to claim that romantic love is somehow suspicious or questionable in and of itself, because there have been instances of it causing warfare? See, the fact is that we're dealing with human beings, whether we're dealing with Christians or not. The underlying premise here seems to be rather that if a human being adheres to a true religion, that true religion will somehow magically stop him from falling into violence or from leading his state into violent conflict with another. But is that in any way reasonable? There is no, and has never been any, guarantee on the part of Christianity that converts to the faith will somehow magically become perfect or ideal beings. Christians very much view their lives as being a kind of warfare against demonic powers, a continual and ongoing struggle against things like sin, temptation, and evil. The fact that Christians too can engage in warfare, even with one another, is by this view simply a confirmation of our view of the world, rather than an objection reaction to it.
And it's worth asking, wherever there is a totally non-religious conflict, do you think that such a conflict would be calmed or exacerbated if we were to introduce religious conviction?
Well, now it depends, doesn't it? I mean, if both sides share a common religious conviction, that it might well attenuate at least some of the harsher excesses of war. If there is a difference in religion between the two sides, then yes, it very well may exacerbate the tensions between them. In the same way that differences in political ideology can exacerbate tensions between two sides in a political war. Are we therefore to claim that perhaps it would be better if people just stopped holding political convictions? Again, I think that the underlying premise here is unspoken. The underlying premise is that religion is simply devoid of any kind of truth value. And if you assume such a thing, then by all means, religion should play no part in human affairs. Then of course it is much more culpable for any damage that it brings about. But if you assume rather that there is or could be such a thing as a true religion, well then the equation changes considerably, and the harshness of the rancor or the violence between two sides in any kind of religious dispute takes on a different view.
Even a believer can accept that many religions do often cause conflicts, or at least make them worse.
And this believer, for one, absolutely acknowledges that fact, but this, to my mind, is nothing other than the simple observation that error is more likely to lead to violence than truth.
A lot of evil has been done in the name of religion. This is true, but the most murderous people in human history have been atheists.
I just want to point out that whilst religious violence is motivated by religious beliefs, atheist violence is rarely motivated by atheism. It's at best permitted by someone's atheism, but then religious violence is also permitted by the person's religious beliefs as well as being encouraged by them.
I can agree with Mr. O'Connor here in a very qualified way. I think it's true that generally speaking, atheism does not promote violence as such. Atheism, of course, is simply the absence of beliefs, as the atheists like to insist. So naturally, it's not going to impel a human being toward any given end. At least not directly. Now there are two claims here that need to be broken apart and dissected a bit. The first is that religion both permits and encourages violent actions toward other human beings. Now this is certainly the case of some religions, but is it the case of all religions? Mr. O'Connor can of course produce a great many historical cases in which Christians have explicitly used their beliefs in order to justify radical, violent, revolutionary acts, what have you. This kind of thing does happen. But that's very different from claiming that the religion itself produces and encourages these acts. If Mr. O'Connor is going to say that that itself is a problem, then I would like to see exactly what he thinks about science in this regard. The last century is rife with examples of science being used to promote absolutely heinous and unconscionable acts against other human beings. Eugenics, euthanasia, racially motivated programs to attempt in some way to produce a higher quality of human being. Now, I don't think that one can put this on the conscience of science as such, at least not with a very lengthy and intricate argument, and I think the same absolutely holds for religious beliefs in general. You cannot presume a connection here. Now, the other part of this problem comes with atheism itself, and whether or not atheism in some way leads to an increase in violence. And while I agree with Mr. O'Connor that the connection here is not generally direct, although there have been cases of atheists hunting out believers and actually targeting them for political oppression or elimination, the question to me is not so much whether atheism actually produces in any kind of direct way these sorts of actions, but whether it opens up the possibility for these kinds of actions in a way that religious belief tends not to. Now, I want to set this out as a premise. Human decency is possible under a great many different kinds of beliefs. There are fundamentally decent Christians, there are fundamentally decent Muslims, there are fundamentally decent atheists, etc., etc., etc. Similarly, monstrous acts and monstrous human beings can exist in a great variety of ideologies and under a great variety of worldviews. There can be an atheistic monster, there can be a Christian monster. I doubt I need to outline any of the more reprehensible actions for which Christians have historically been responsible, particularly in recent centuries, for anyone who follows Mr. O'Connor's channel. But it might also be the case that under a certain worldview, on the whole, on the aggregate, certain actions become possible that are not possible under different worldviews. So I'll give you some just very straightforward examples. In pagan antiquity, it was common to leave children out on the hillside to die if they weren't deemed to be in some way desirable by the family that had produced them. Or to take another example that Mr. O'Connor will be shortly focusing on, slavery has in many parts of the world and in many historical moments been considered not only morally acceptable, but even in some way laudable and desirable. Under different worldviews, these kinds of actions no longer become possible. Now the question is, what kinds of moral limitations would an atheist worldview put on human beings? If atheism were widely accepted in society, such that most people just consider themselves automatically to be atheists, what would the moral consequences of that be? What actions would become possible that were not possible before? What actions would cease to be possible that had been acceptable before? Now, it's my view that precisely because of its negative stance toward things, its refusal to make any kind of positive claims, atheism actually opens up possibilities of immorality that were less possible, less feasible under the older religious frameworks. Is that to say that they were impossible? Of course not. To return to this once again, Christians are human beings, and human beings can do terrible things to one another. But I do not see in atheism any reason not to in many cases. I do not see in atheism any kind of a moral matrix which might help to encourage certain kinds of moral acts or to forbid or discredit certain kinds of immoral ones. In fact, I think it's very difficult to establish any kind of morality whatsoever under an atheist position, and I think that Mr. O'Connor is almost in agreement with me about this, although he doesn't discuss this in the present video. I might make another video about that at some future point, because I think that it's actually a very, very interesting and important matter to consider. Now, this kind of causality that I'm suggesting is much more difficult to trace than a more direct causality. If you have a given religion which promotes the use of the sword in order to obtain religious ends, that's an obvious instance of a very clear connection between the proclamations of the faith and the actions that the faithful are expected to perform in the world. You'll find nothing like that in atheism. I'm proposing a more indirect kind of causality whereby atheism produces the kind of atmosphere or world in which a growing immorality, a growing self-centeredness, even a growing contempt for one's fellow human beings can be normalized and made possible. And I recognize that that too would require a much more in-depth argument. But I will throw that out there as a real problem that I think Mr. O'Connor is not adequately considering in his present line of argument.
If you were born somewhere else, you wouldn't be a Christian. Okay, and if you were born somewhere else, you wouldn't be an atheist. Everyone's beliefs are shaped by their context.
Well, this just misses the point. Sure, all beliefs are shaped by their geography, but atheists don't claim that there's a God supervising the world who proactively wants everyone to believe in him. If such a God did exist, would we really expect him to reveal himself more strongly and reliably to, say, Americans than to Indonesians? It seems incredibly unlikely and unfair that your chances of being saved, of coming to know the true God, could be determined by where you happen to be born.
Now, we're running up against a wall here that we're going to encounter a few more times over the course of this video, which comes down to exactly how one should understand what to expect from a deity who is by definition transcendent of anything that we can actually comprehend. I'm a Christian, therefore I believe in a God who created the entirety of the cosmos, and therefore stands outside of the entirety of the cosmos in ways that I am not able to understand. This God exceeds my ability to comprehend him. What I know of this God is what is given to me in revelation. Even this revelation obviously passes through the distorting lens of my particular categories of understanding, the world in which I live. It arrives to me as a kind of analogy, and even this word analogy isn't quite right, because we're speaking again of a being who exceeds our very ability to define. This is one of the reasons that my faith is full of mysteries. I mean, if you presuppose the existence of such a God, just for a moment, just for the purposes of intellectual curiosity, it's evidently profoundly arrogant for us as limited and ignorant beings, creatures of the world, to attempt to judge the actions or the inactions of this absolutely transcendent deity by virtue of our very, very limited capacities. But setting that aside, there's a deeper problem here, and that's that our expectations of what we should see in the world are profoundly shaped by our priors. Mr. O'Connor is very quick to speak about what we should expect if there is an all-powerful deity who wants us all to believe in him, but it's not immediately clear to me what we should expect in such a case. Should we expect this deity to appear before all of us, like a genie or something of the kind, to tell us who he is and what he wants from us? Would that be satisfying to Mr. O'Connor? Do we want a deity who doesn't even present us with the opportunity to say yes or no to him, but just programs us, robot-wise, with an automatic obedience? Would that be satisfying? Would it be satisfying if he appeared singularly before the entire world in all of his greatness in the sky and terrorized us, terrified us to the point that we all had to bow down before him? Would that be satisfying? I mean, what is the alternative here against which we're judging these expectations? And above all, can you provide me any kind of alternative whatsoever which respects human freedom in the way that the present world does? I'd be very curious to see that, because I, for one, can't think of an alternative of that kind.
It's no surprise that where you're born shapes your religious beliefs, because that's what we think religious beliefs are, products of local mythology or political dominance.
But I think there's a deeper problem here, Mr. O'Connor, which you're not addressing. You seem to be suggesting that your atheist beliefs are on par with the religious doctrines which you evidently don't want to accept. And you're very quick to simply acknowledge that these religious beliefs are nothing other than the product of their historical moment. That is to say, they are errors which are brought into existence by the limitations and the ignorance of the time in which they emerged. Does atheism have the same status? Is atheism simply another ignorant and limited worldview which is produced by the time in which we are living? I don't think that you'd be satisfied saying that. I think that you probably want to exempt atheism in some way from this kind of view of historical determination. Atheism is the exception to the rule. It's not the new religion of our times. I think that you would want to claim this. So how and why do you exempt atheism from this kind of historical determination that you proposed for the religions of our past? Now, I actually don't find myself in the same kind of a conundrum, and this for a couple of different reasons. First of all, I'm not willing to give credence to the idea of historical determination of errors. Every time has its errors, there's no doubt about it. We are all born into societies which promote any number of falsehoods. But I'm not constrained to say, as you are, that these falsehoods in the past were nothing but rankest superstition, that had no basis in reality whatsoever, and were simply owing to a kind of astonishing and society-wide illusion. I believe that the religions of the past were actually very firmly grounded in very real personal experiences, and that these real personal experiences touched in some way or reflected in some way on the reality of our human situation. The gods of the pagans were not inventions. They were not simple errors of deduction or induction. They were real beings with real powers who acted on the world. Now, the manner of that acting and the relation of the specific religions to the beings themselves is a different question. But I'm not reduced to saying that these people were living under a historically determined set of lies and outright falsehoods about the world. One of the things that I contest in atheism is in fact its contempt of the past, which is a necessary feature of atheism. If you are an atheist, you have to believe that most human beings at most times were so stupid or so deluded that they could not see past their own noses. You have to approach the past in a spirit of contempt. As a Christian, I'm not compelled to do this. And I'm not compelled to do this for another very important reason, which is, again, part and parcel of my faith, which is exactly the thing that you're pointing to here as a problem in Christianity, but to me is actually one of its qualities, one of its features, which is to say that God acts in a historical way. He acts at historical moments. He doesn't interfere with the creation as such. He arrives at specific times and places very concretely. He brings the truth in a way that human beings can fundamentally understand because we can fundamentally relate to it, connect to it, interact with it. Now, this historical aspect of Christianity also implies that there is a time before Christianity, before Christ, and the time following Christianity, after Christ. And this is a fundamental division in the very fabric of history itself. The truth, if you will, makes its appearance at a specific historical moment. And the appearance of that truth gives to the church the ability to reasonably differentiate between truth and falsity, which is to say that there is a real and active standard by which we can judge of things that are historically determined, historically contingent, and things which are not. I don't believe that you have any such referent, Mr. O'Connor, and I don't believe that atheism can have any such referent. I don't think that there is any way that you can actually justify your belief in atheism from a position of historical determinism in a way which also transcends that same historical determinism. But I might be wrong about this, and I'd be very interested in hearing your response.
By the way, I call this the genetic fallacy.
And I call this the fallacy.
How do you know which religion is true? Well, everyone, religious or not, has faith in a certain worldview. It's just that some worldviews are called religions and some are secular. But everyone has to ask the question of which worldview best explains the world.
Nothing to add here. Yes, every worldview should be justified.
So I think that this might be the single point in the course of this entire video where all three of us actually agree about something. Cause for celebration?
The Bible has contradictions. Okay, you think you found an apparent contradiction that the church hasn't known about for 2,000 years? Every apparent contradiction can be explained by understanding just a little bit of theology.
Every contradiction? All of them? Look, you're right. I wouldn't claim to have discovered some new contradiction that nobody has noticed before. I would just say that the proposed solutions to many of them seem to be, shall we say, theologically motivated. The one contradiction that you flashed on screen is probably the least troublesome contradiction that you could possibly have chosen. So, how about, for instance, 1. Matthew and Luke give different genealogies for Jesus' lineage.
For reasons of time, I'm not going to go through the contradictions that Mr. O'Connor proposes. Again, you're welcome to look at that in the original video. I also am not going to look at these specifically because I think that he and I basically agree that these are fairly trivial cases when you're looking at the actual scope and arc of the biblical teaching itself.
Sure, if you absolutely need the accounts to harmonize, you can suggest all kinds of reasons for this apparent contradiction. But wouldn't it be easier to just say that, yeah, the accounts are different? Because, look, who the hell cares about small contradictions?
Now, he is responding to a very specific kind of contemporary Christianity, which wishes to harmonize all of the gospel accounts, all of the biblical accounts, in such a way that there are no factual discrepancies whatsoever between them. And I happen to agree with him that this can't be done. The question, rather, is whether this is a matter of any importance for the Christian. Whether this should in some measure make us call into question, or at least be somewhat more skeptical about the basic tenets of the faith. I mean, if the gospel writers couldn't get their story straight even on the factual level, how can we expect them to do so on any other level? If these differences in account are present in the Bible, if there really are this kind of error in the Bible, then doesn't that somewhat call into question the idea that this Bible is inspired by God? And this not even to talk about those who believe that the Bible was actually written by God. I'd like to know exactly what they mean by that, but in any case, that's a different set of questions. And Mr. O'Connor actually states this question.
It's not impossible to reconcile them in this kind of way, but doesn't the need to do so at least slightly lower your credence in the text?
I think once again, Mr. O'Connor and I are very much in agreement on one point. What you believe about the Bible, the kind of book that you think it is, and the purpose that you believe it has in the world, are inevitably going to shape your reading of the text, the way that you read the text, and what you are willing to accept or not accept from it. If you consider this work to be the product of a number of mere ignorant human beings who were simply fumblingly attempt to understand a number of experiences they'd had with a Jewish rabbi who was then martyred by the Romans, well then obviously you're going to pick out these passages as clear signs which support your thesis. If you look at this text as having been written by God himself, and thus absolutely inerrant in every single way, then you are going to do handstands in order to produce some kind of concurrence between these disparate passages. I hope it goes without saying that these are not the only two positions possible with respect to this text. Indeed, the traditional Christian view has always been that this text is written by human beings and is inspired by the Holy Spirit. Now, the question of what that inspiration means is, of course, an enormous one. The atheist approaches this problem, I think, by taking the Bible in a certain way very seriously in its claims. The atheist takes at face value the Bible's claim to be interested in the truth, and the atheist then attempts to evaluate its truth claims in the way that the atheist is most liable to do, which is to say by modern, contemporary, scientific, historical standards. There is a whole worldview beneath this particular approach to the text, which is unspoken in the approach itself. Now, as I've discussed at length in my series on history, the past had a very different view of the truth than we do today. The past did not understand truth as being fundamentally a matter of factuality, or even factual consistency. I mean, to put this, I think, in somewhat classically Christian terms, factual consistency is not going to save anybody's soul. Now, the Bible concerns itself with salvation. It understands truth in the light of salvation and salvation in the light of truth. This is all wrapped up in what it means that Jesus Christ is the Logos, the incarnate Word. The Bible is not attempting to produce a historical account in the way that we understand historical accounts, that a person can read and take at face value and understand as being kind of a blow-by-blow of what happened. The Bible is attempting to present things in such a way that human growth towards salvation is possible. I mean, turn this on its head, look at it from a different light. If upon the death of Jesus Christ of Nazareth, the apostles or their disciples had set out to write a series of strictly historical accounts of what had happened, according in every way to modern historical standards, a kind of McCullough-esque biography of Jesus Christ, would such a thing have produced the same effects in that world? Would we today even be discussing Christianity as a possible way of life for a modern human being? Or would it not have just simply vanished away as so many cults of its time did? Now, Mr. O'Connor is quick to take to task all of those theologians who attempted to find some kind of explanation for these factual discrepancies that have been found within the course of the New Testament. But the fact is that their accounts are much, much morally richer than any kind of merely factual account could ever have been. They open up a certain richness even of interpretation, which I think propels us to a different kind of spiritual state than we could expect from a mere biographical blow-by-blow account of Jesus Christ and his life and deeds. And on the other side, I can't help but point out that if the four Gospels really did agree down to every single detail in their accounts, this would almost certainly open them to charges of conspiracy. Mr. O'Connor himself will make this point later on.
If these documents are truly historical accounts, we'd expect them to have minor differences as people try to accurately remember events and remember them slightly differently. If two witnesses in a court case give a story that perfectly matches up in every single detail, that's actually cause for suspicion. It's evidence that they've made up the story and rehearsed it.
The discrepancies between the texts are demonstrations that they were written by four different individuals with four different views on the events at hand, which is to say that they weren't compiled by a single entity, be it the Church or Constantine, among some of the wilder conspiracy theories that have been presented. The atheist very often is presented with an embarrassment of riches, because whichever way these things go, he always lands on his feet. There's always something that you can bring against the Bible. But just to round off this question of what exactly it means for the Bible to be a true document, and whether or not strict factual consistency plays any part in that, Let me close with a question both to my atheist friends and to my literalist Christian friends who very often simply follow in their footsteps and try to respond to the scientistic way of viewing these things. And I'm going to pose a question, in fact, which is presented by one of the few New Testament figures which a great many atheists often seem to find agreeable in some manner. What is truth?
Gospels were anonymous. Okay, anonymous doesn't mean we have no idea who wrote them. It just means the names of the authors aren't signed in the text itself. But we literally have writings from church fathers who knew the apostles and can verify that they indeed wrote the books named after them.
Okay, the consensus of New Testament scholars seems to be that we don't have sufficient evidence for the traditional authorship of the Gospels. But what was it that you just said? We literally have writings from church fathers who can verify the traditional authorship of the Gospels? You've shown a picture on screen of St. Ignatius of Antioch, who, look, I don't know very much about, but I think you've basically just lied about him. We only know anything about him at all via his letters and tradition. Tradition which states he was a disciple of John, but with very patchy evidence.
Given Redeemed Zoomer's presentation, I have to agree with Mr. O'Connor's critiques here. But I think that the real question is actually concealed under this question of which church father said or didn't say what. The real question, as is indicated by Mr. O'Connor's line of reasoning, is the status that we are willing or unwilling to give to Christian tradition in these particular arguments. And once again, your answer to this question is going to depend on your pre-commitments, the conclusions that you have already reached about the validity or invalidity of the faith. Now, I believe that it's probably as possible to come up with a coherent atheistic account of the church tradition and all of its various failings and the way that errors slipped in over the course of generations, or perhaps also as a result of deliberate malice, as it is to give a Christian account of the tradition by which the truth is transmitted from generation to generation in an unbroken line, an unbroken chain extending from the days of Christ to the present. I have not for one seen evidence persuasive or damning enough on either side of this question to persuade me that one or the other is the more clearly valid historical view of the Christian tradition. And part of the problem here is that historical investigations as such are not objective and impartial critiques into the past. They are always concerned in gathering and arranging knowledge, and the way that you gather and the way that you arrange is going to depend on your prior commitments. The value that you are willing to give to a piece of evidence depends not on that piece of evidence itself, any kind of value inherent to it, but rather the way that it accords or does not accord with the things that you know or think you know or believe. Now, Mr. O'Connor is firmly in favor of his own tradition, the modern scholarly tradition which takes its lights by science or by a science-informed republic of letters more generally. In moments of dispute or contradiction between modernity and antiquity, between the modern republic of letters and the ancient Christian tradition, the Christian is more willing to give authority to the Christian tradition than to the republic of letters, or to the scientific community. Similarly, a great many Christians, including myself, believe that there is probably more reason to be skeptical of our modern traditions than of the ancient traditions. Now, I suspect that this might be flabbergasting to some atheists, perhaps Mr. O'Connor among them. But before this dispute can actually be reasonably carried out, not to speak of adjudicated, I think the terms have to be established properly. And I don't believe that Redeemed Zoomer has done a particularly good job of that in this case. And consequently, Mr. O'Connor, who in this case is simply responding to Redeemed Zoomer, has left the matter at a very superficial level.
The Gospels misquote Jesus. Now, it's true that a lot of secular scholars think the Gospels are a mix of real quotes from the historical Jesus and fake quotes added by the church.
Wait, hold on. It's true that some secular scholars think this? What other kind of scholars do you want? Religiously motivated ones? Secular just means not affected by religion, which any scholar should be in regards to their scholarship, even if they're a Christian.
Now, this is a very interesting point and actually comes right off of the back of what I was just saying. There's a whole swarm of presuppositions here about the proper approach to knowledge and how knowledge should rightly be accumulated or handled. And it's a very modern scientific standpoint that Mr. O'Connor takes here. I say that to some extent to his credit. I think there's something honorable about the modern approach to knowledge, but I'm very far from being sure that it's adequate. The supposition here is that the scholar is better able to come to right conclusions if he begins from an impartial point of view. An impartiality which I believe probably means value neutrality, which is to say that he does not have any prior commitments to any of the things that he is studying. And the question is whether that is actually an adequate way of studying anything at all, or even if it is possible. Take as an analogy the human sense perception of vision, of sight. Now, if we were to look at the world and see in the world nothing but an undifferentiated mass of colors and gradations of color, if the perception were to come to us, let's say, raw, impartially as it were, what sense would we be able to make of the world at all? What sense would we be able to make of our sense perceptions? What sense would we be able to make of our visual field? Whenever we look at the world, we are already subjecting the world to a tacit series of assessments, of evaluations about the nature of the things surrounding us. We divide the world into objects, into discrete beings. There are already a number of judgments contained in the mere act of seeing. And if we don't have any kind of judgment whatsoever, then we're not given the possibility of actually analyzing anything in front of us. Sense data is subjected automatically and without any kind of prior reflection on our part to a number of different hierarchical filters, almost judgments, one might say. Some of the objects in the world surrounding us strike us as being more important than others, and they naturally call our attention to them. Something very similar happens when we look back into the past and attempt to analyze the events of the past. In the first place, of course, the data that we're looking at, if we want to call it data, is given to us by a series of judgments that these specific individuals already placed on their time, which is to say that the historians who wrote down the events of their time were already picking and choosing what they thought was important and what they thought was not. And we are doing something very similar as we look back at their accounts. We're doing so, however, by a different set of judgments, a different set of values than they probably had. So there's already a question here of whether we can be impartial at all when we look at the past, and what that means of our view of the past if we can't. But beyond this, there's something else. Any view of the past, and it doesn't matter how neutral it tries to be, is always forced to some extent or another to pass judgment on the past on the basis of its view of the world as such. And this will necessarily bias the things that it chooses to bring into relief, or the things that it chooses to put to a lower level of consideration, or the things that it chooses to ignore completely. Now, if we take two scholars, the secular scholar and the Christian scholar, and we have them both look at the same phenomena in the past, which is to say, the specific historical trajectory of Christianity over the course of time, they will come to necessarily different conclusions on the basis of their specific positions, their specific starting points. The only way that one could legitimately favor one over the other is if one is convinced that one of them has the truer position to begin with. Now, the impartial and secular scholar presumably begins from a point of view of not knowing the truth at all, which is to say that he is actually setting out in an attempt to gather the truth, to garner the truth through his very studies. This is the basis of his impartiality. The truth that he adheres to, in other words, is the truth of not having the truth. So in order to defend his position, he has to be able to give an account as to why that initial impartiality will allow him to get closer to the phenomena in themselves, or the truth of matters in the past, than will a specific position, such as the Christians. And this means that he has to have standards for meaningfully being able to differentiate between bias on the one hand, and a correct hierarchy of values on the other, such that any interpretation which a Christian scholar comes to can be said to pertain to the one and not to the other. That is to say, it is a willful or unconscious perversion of the truth in order to accord with a predefined set of ideas, as opposed to simply a perspective which enables the Christian to see things that the impartial scholar cannot, or to put things in their right place in a way that the impartial scholar is incapable of doing. Now, this is a very complicated question, and I simply point to it because I don't think that it's quite adequate to simply insist wholesale on the superiority of a neutral or secular scholar over the Christian scholar.
Now, it's true that a lot of secular scholars think the Gospels are a mix of real quotes from the historical Jesus and fake quotes added by the church, but none of them can agree on which quotes are legit and which are not, so we can discard their opinions.
Because scholars can't agree on which quotes of Jesus are legitimate, we can throw out their skepticism? What? The whole argument is precisely that scholars can't agree on which quotes of Jesus are authentic. That's the whole problem. Do you really think that this lack of consensus about which quotes are authentic is a problem not with the quotes, but with the scholars? Come on.
So if you're looking for somebody to defend this position that you consider so completely outlandish, Mr. O'Connor, I'm your huckleberry. And in fact, I might be just as bewildered by your position as you seem to be by mine. The idea seems to be that a number of contemporary scholars, removed from the life and acts of Jesus Christ by some 2 millennia, and living in a world which is vastly different from his own world in practically every respect, be it culturally or socially or politically or linguistically, nonetheless have more right to decide what might have been the truth about his teachings than do individuals who were alive within living memory of his life and deeds and words. I mean, we're supposed to believe that some random university professor who spends all of his days reading books is somehow going to have a clearer idea of what Jesus Christ actually said than individuals who were actually present when he made these utterances and declarations? Honestly, Mr. O'Connor, this seems to me the more indefensible of the two positions.
Hey, here's a fun exercise. Try, without rewinding this video, to write down the exact contents of my previous sentence. I mean it. Pause the video, write down the last sentence I just said, word for word, and then compare it to what I actually said. I bet you can't remember it accurately, at least not perfectly. And yet, you heard me say it mere seconds ago. Now consider that even the most conservative estimates place the authorship of the Gospels at least decades after Jesus' death. And yet we're supposed to believe that they never misquote Jesus?
With all due respect, Mr. O'Connor, the words of Jesus of Nazareth can't be put on the same level as some offhand remark by a person on the internet. I mean, I think there's a better question to ask than the one that you've proposed for us. If you think back to some person who had fundamental importance in changing or shaping your life, I don't know, a mentor or one of your parents or a university professor or a high school teacher, can you remember things that they told you? Even if they said these things only once, and you were the only one who heard them, and you never told anybody else, and this happened decades ago? I mean, I know that I can, and I have a disgraceful wreck of a memory. Now, in the case of Jesus Christ, we're speaking of a beloved teacher, a man who was even literally revered by the writers of the gospel in time to come. With many of his teachings, it's unlikely that we're talking about just single utterances of his. He probably repeated them on numerous occasions. In most of these cases, the disciples were not even alone when they heard these utterances, but they were with one another. And it's probable, given the fact that they considered this man at the very least a very wise rabbi, that they would have repeated these utterances again and again in their own company, in time to come, and over the course of the years. So the statements that are recorded in the Bible have a fundamentally different status, a different salience in memory, if you will, than the comments that you have made over the course of your video. And I'll just add to this as an interesting aside. There is some reason to speculate, some reason to believe that probably memory in the past was much stronger than it happens to be in our contemporary times. I mean, if you consider these people, they were living in a world with vanishingly low literacy rates. It's not as if they could just jot down their stray thoughts as they came to them in order to remember that they had to do this or do that over the course of the day, in order to give themselves some kind of memento of things that they'd heard. They had to commit a great deal more to their memory than we of today do. And this has been true following the rise in literacy rates over the past, say, 500 years. Not even to speak of our modern moment in which we can leave ourselves things like voice memos. There is a great deal of at least anecdotal evidence which suggests that memory in antiquity was far stronger than it is today. We have accounts of people who were able to memorize entire texts in just a couple of readings. And if you consider the fact that manuscripts were extraordinarily expensive, they were covetously guarded in libraries or very, very small personal collections, then it's evident that it's not as if people could rely on being able to just return again and again to the same books. They had to have stronger memories for the context in which they lived. Now, of course, it could be retorted to this that I'm already speaking of people who were literate, that is to say, people at a very high level of intelligence and of memory. And this might not have carried down into the lower classes, many of whom were the at least purported writers of the Gospels. So I don't consider this a knockout argument by any means, but I think that it is something worth considering. But there are also at least anecdotal accounts of individuals tracking oral records over the course of time or in different geographical locations and finding them largely unaltered, which also suggests that this kind of strength of memory might have been something present as well in the lower classes, as much as in the upper. Be all of that how it might, I bring this up simply as another thing to consider when we're trying to work our way through the problem of memory and the records that are contained in the Gospels.
Christianity supported slavery. Well, sure, some Christians did, but all human civilizations have had slavery. Christian civilization was the first one to abolish it on moral grounds.
Sure, many societies condone slavery throughout history, but you claim that your tradition is the correct one, with access to the will of the God of the universe. Yes, Aristotle condoned slavery, but his Politics is not thought to be a divinely authored text. Why did it take so long, literally over 1,000 years, for Christian society to abolish slavery if it was so obviously against God's will the whole time?
Because we live in a fallen world, Mr. O'Connor. Now, I admit, I've always been somewhat perplexed by this particular argument against Christianity. I recognize, of course, the moral weight that it contains. I suspect that's its principal allure, but it seems to rely on an extraordinarily facile reading of human history, one according to which, again, God is expected to simply and fundamentally and radically change the nature of human beings or societies. There seems to be, once again, an expectation here that the proper way of going about things would have been to write in clear letters in the midst of the Bible, slavery is to be abolished starting now, or something to this effect. Thou shalt no longer hold slaves, or something along these lines. As if ancient slavery could just up and be abolished without any consequences or ramifications beyond the general jubilation of the freed. But of course this is preposterous. As just an example, the Roman society in which Christianity emerged was economically dependent upon slavery. The abolition of slavery would have opened Rome to foreign invasions, to civil war, to any number of evils which would have been certainly far worse than that which they meant to rectify. Similarly, in the Old Testament, one has to consider the general context in which these verses appear. One has to compare, that is to say, the law of the Israelites to the laws which governed the people surrounding them. Slaves in antiquity were protected by precisely no laws whatsoever. Now, talk of progressive laws. The laws of the ancient Israelites, which accord any kind of dignity whatsoever to the figure of the slave, were absolutely extraordinary for the time in which they occurred. Now, Mr. O'Connor's point here, once again, is that we would expect to see from a divinely inspired work not a gradual improvement over what came before, but a total break with all of the wickedness that had preceded it. And that depends in turn upon a very specific idea of the role of Scripture in the world in which it was thrown. There seems to be a notion here that the arrival of the Holy Scripture in some way or other should have just simply revolutionized society, transformed the very face of the world, and made it into something much more like to a paradise on earth. Where are you getting those expectations, however? Scripture is intended for a specific place and a specific time, and this is true whether you believe that Scripture is divinely revealed or whether you think that it's simply a human writ. If it's simply a human writ, then it's obviously contingent upon its historical moment. If it is divinely revealed, on the other hand, then it was clearly given to a specific time with specific purposes in mind. Now, whatever speculation one might have as to why God went about things this way, there's at least one thing that's fairly clear, I think, from the whole of both Old Testament and New Testament teachings, and that's that these scriptures are meant in some way to be transformative over the long term. See, Christianity was not a revolutionary religion. It did not come into the world wielding a sword and a firebrand. It is meant to be a transformative religion, which changes human hearts and human societies over large arcs of time. By a very ancient Christian saying, the church was fed by the blood of the martyrs. That is to say, individuals who, rather than taking up the sword against their enemies, rather permitted themselves to be cut down by the same. Christianity never intended to transform the world into a kind of earthly paradise. In fact, by Christian teaching, such a thing is impossible. And it seems to me that this Christian teaching is fundamentally more realistic than any kind of objection to Christianity and its failure to eliminate slavery, such as Mr. O'Connor has proposed. There's a kind of idealism to this account which I don't find to be reconcilable with the nature of the world. I mean, I'll offer simply a single, rather inconvenient example about all of this. Now, I think that it's safe to presume, based on things that I've seen in other of Mr. O'Connor's videos, that he would not hesitate to denounce things like child labor or indentured servitude. And I presume that he's also at least somewhat conscious of the conditions in which the mine workers live, who have actually mined the resources through which we are able to build the machines that permit us to carry on this conversation at present. I'm confident he can imagine the kind of economic and international turmoil which will be brought about by a closure of these mines in order to defend the rights of the workers within. I think it's fairly clear why we can't expect a summary moratorium on cobalt mining in the near future, for example. Slavery is a problem that we have managed very effectively to outsource and to put beyond our field of vision, but it's not something that we've managed to obliterate altogether. And yet it's somehow assumed that the Christians of antiquity could have just up and abolished the slavery that formed a fundamental part of their social fabric, and they're taken to task for failing to do so. Once again, the atheist has the best of both worlds, because if he's looking at the text and sees no denunciation of slavery as an institution, he can say that Christianity is failing to live up to its moral standards. Whereas if he were to look at the text and to see slavery denounced from the outgo, he could as easily have claimed it was an idealistic and indeed insane attempt to rework the world in an impossible way. Mr. O'Connor has also pointed to numerous occasions in which the Bible was used to defend slavery in fairly recent days. But I think the far more interesting question is how slavery was originally considered by the earliest Christians within the context of the tradition which carried on, at least according to its own inner statements, the teachings of Jesus Christ. And in the writings and the proclamations of the patristic era, I think we're given a fairly unambiguous picture. Slavery was accepted as a necessary evil, but it was also denounced very firmly by men of the status of St. Augustine of Hippo, or St. John Chrysostom. And here I have to come back to Redeemed Zoomer's original comment about all of this. Mr. O'Connor is indeed eliding the fundamental distinction between acknowledging the existence of a phenomenon and justifying the existence of a phenomenon within the holy texts. The fact that slavery was accepted as a given by these texts is somewhat equivalent to the fact that sin was accepted as a given by these texts. Christians do not expect sin to simply vanish because Jesus Christ came into the world. Sin is a necessary part of our human existence. And slavery, too, could be said to be a necessary part, at least, of that ancient world. There's a related facet to all of this which I think we have to bring out. I'm not altogether of the opinion that it was Christianity that abolished slavery, as many of my fellow Christians like to claim. I think this is probably as facile of a support for Christianity as is using the fact that Christianity didn't abolish slavery as an objection against the same. Slavery fell into disuse because it could fall into disuse, and this was thanks particularly to the technological revolutions of the recent centuries. It may well be the case that slavery was abolished thanks to a kind of moral pressure which was owing to the Christian traditions of the time. As you can hear, my ducks strongly agree with this position, but it was not the case that Christianity as such destroyed slavery. Now, the technological revolutions which made possible the gradual abolition of slavery, at least in the Western world, were the product, of course, of the Enlightenment. Now, Redeemed Zoomer, in a part of his video that I won't be including in my own, makes the claim that the scientific revolution was somehow owing to Christianity. And while I think that there's perhaps an element of truth involved in all of this, I think that it fundamentally misses the point and also misunderstands the nature of the scientific revolution. You can see how much my ducks enjoy philosophical and theological discourse. They just can't help but put in a word. Now, the scientific revolution and the technological revolutions that it brought about depended fundamentally on a kind of liberation of free inquiry of a certain kind, a sort of inquiry that in prior times had been submitted always to a higher authority, whether of the state or of the church. The liberation of this kind of research, the liberation of this kind of discourse, and the liberation of these powers has led us to the present day. And in point of fact, we have been able to eliminate a great many ills. Our medicine has eliminated a great many diseases. We've been able to abolish at least the older forms of slavery. And there is a degree of generalized wealth that prior ages could only have dreamt. So I don't mean to belittle or dismiss the goods that have been brought about by these movements. But at the same time, the final balance has not been given. We don't know where this present road is leading us. And it would take, I think, a degree of blindness or ingenuity to suggest that the advancement of our science and our technology will lead exclusively to a progress in good and never an advancement of evil. I think, particularly in our present and very pivotal moment, it would be rash and the highest to claim such a thing. The fact of the matter is we cannot say with any great assurance that past times were in error for attempting to suppress these particular forms of inquiry and these particular powers. We cannot say with assurance that the very forces which permitted us to abolish slavery won't lead to still far greater evils in the very near future. This is not to claim that they will, it's simply to say that this is still very much an open question. And I think that this needs to be pointed out as well in any kind of attempted analysis of the relationship of Christianity to slavery.
The fact that you're against slavery is due to Christian influence. Also, most organizations fighting modern-day slavery are Christian.
Okay, to say that I today am against slavery due to exclusively Christian influence is laughable. I know this whole Western ethics are all secretly Christian idea is popular at the moment, but you show me exactly where in your Bible I can find justification for abolishing slavery.
So once again, I have to protest on the basis of a number of points that I've already touched upon. Mr. O'Connor, you are, I believe, approaching the Bible from a very Protestant standpoint. You're presuming that the sacred text itself is somehow sufficient to the teaching of the faith, and that its mere advent in the world is somehow supposed to, in and of itself, give us precisely the moral teachings and the moral compass that we need as human beings. This is historically wrong-headed and has absolutely no relation whatsoever to the way that this text actually worked in its time and its place. It was embedded very much within the field of a tradition. That tradition helped to understand the text and to interpret the text and to show how the text was relevant to the daily life of the parishioners, the faithful of the time. If you bring the text outside of the context of that tradition and attempt to understand it in isolation, then it can mean any number of different things. All bets are off, and chaos enters the scene very rapidly. Now, I've already pointed to the way that this text was actually understood by the original Christians within the earliest centuries of the church's growth and development. And I personally find that to be far more binding and suggestive than some latter-day interpretation which is arrived at by, say, an abolitionist or a slaveholder, in places and in times where this original tradition had either been deliberately obscured or outright forgotten. I can use the text of the Bible to defend just about anything if I'm so minded. I could use it to defend genocide. I could use it to defend communism. I could use it to defend absolute loathing for the world and for material things. And I can use it to defend the contrary of all of these things. So the question of the canon of interpretation is opened. Now, the atheist tends, I think, toward the Protestant perspective for a number of reasons. First of all, he has no reason to give his allegiance to the tradition, so, who actually cares what the tradition taught about sacred scripture or about its teachings? But on the other hand, I think that it's also far easier to assail this book if you consider it just an isolated compendium of writings, and which has no stable lens by which to understand and interpret it. Now, as to the question as to why we of today are so contrary to slavery and whether that has any relation to Christianity, I think that Nietzsche probably said just about everything that needs to be said about this particular question. Since Mr. O'Connor cites Nietzsche in another part of his video, I presume that he's also probably aware of where Nietzsche came down on the question of slavery. Nietzsche, who I believe pushed atheism just about as far as it can be pushed. There really is a question as to why anyone is opposed to slavery nowadays, and how that can be understood if not in the context of a kind of residual Christianity. Certainly absent God or any kind of justification for considering the human being to contain a kind of inherent dignity, I can see no reason why not to enslave my fellow man. Now, I might devote an entire video to Mr. O'Connor's very peculiar notion of morality. But I would ask him this specifically, with reference to his view of morality. You seem to reduce morals merely to the way that you feel about things, Mr. O'Connor. Are you really going to claim that the way that you feel about slavery or about the maltreatment of human beings or other living creatures owes absolutely nothing to the Christian tradition in which I believe you were born and raised? Or the wider society, which is but a late fruit of a Christian worldview?
If God is good, why can't he destroy all evil? Well, he eventually will. Why can't he do it now? Because he'd have to destroy you.
Okay, I totally get the Christian idea that human beings are corrupted and evil. Of course, all of us constantly fall short, even of our own moral standards. Fine. So destroying evil requires destroying us. But you've just said that God will one day destroy all evil. He just can't do it now, because that would mean destroying humans. But what will change so that one day he can destroy evil without destroying humans? And why can't that happen now? As far as I was aware, the thing that allows human beings to escape being justly destroyed for their sin is the sacrifice of Jesus, which happened a good couple of thousand years ago now. So what is God waiting for to destroy evil?
So I gotta take this one up with both of you, Redeemed Zoomer and Mr. O'Connor. The fundamental problem with God's destroying evil is not that he will destroy human beings as well, although that might also be true. And it's also not the case that the birth, the death, and the resurrection of Jesus Christ is in itself sufficient to redeem human beings from the sin into which they're born or to save them from damnation. And I think to address both of these problems, we can come back to the same point, which is the more traditional way of viewing this problem from the Christian point of view. Evil is permitted in the world to allow human beings agency and freedom. This freedom is precisely the freedom to participate or to refuse to participate in God's plan, in God's will. The destruction of evil necessitates stopping human beings from being able to commit evil, which is to say, it necessitates stopping us from being free human beings, free agents in the world. We would cease to be human beings. We would be some other kind of being. And so in that very specific sense, you're correct, Redeemed Zoomer. The destruction of evil would mean the destruction of human beings, which is to say that it would mean the destruction of human being. It would mean the destruction of humanity itself, not because we're wicked, but because we're free. Now, Jesus Christ, with his birth, his death, and his resurrection, has opened up the possibility of redemption for human beings. That is to say, he has offered another dimension to human freedom. But that human freedom remains. Now, by Christian tradition, there will come a moment at the end of times when Jesus Christ returns and essentially brings an end to this age of the creation. But that will only come about at a point in which human freedom, human agency has been destroyed, essentially made invalid in some way, by human beings themselves. The time that God has permitted to this fallen world is in fact a great gift to fallen humanity, because it gives us the chance of redemption. And so long as that chance is present, which is to say, so long as human beings are able to actually freely choose in their lives either the good or the evil, that possibility will be left to us.
But then what changes about the world between now and then that God is suddenly able to destroy evil without destroying humans?
What will change is that at that point in time, human beings will already have ceased to be human beings.
Why does God let any bad things happen? Because we deserve it.
Well, look, I appreciate how blunt this is. I was expecting some kind of theodicy. Evil exists because it's soul-building, or because of free will, or because of heavenly compensation. But no, we just deserve it. Well, fine, but I just want to bring that home for a minute. This week, about 5 children in the UK alone will die from cancer. The most common type of cancer in children is leukemia. I know you wouldn't say this to their face, Redeemed Zoomer, but when a parent asks why on earth this has happened to their child, you think that the in fact correct response is, well, they deserve it. Look, I can't disprove that they do deserve it. Maybe humanity is just so corrupted by original sin or whatever that we do deserve pediatric cancer. But even if we do, why do some people get what they deserve and not others? It's not just that people suffer at all, in other words, but that they do so seemingly randomly and arbitrarily, sometimes by accident of birth or genetics. Lucky for the rest of us, I guess?
I have to side with Mr. O'Connor on this one here. The idea that bad things happen because we deserve them is a fundamentally unsatisfying theodicy. And it also has very little to do with any of the traditional Christian explanations for this problem. Now, according to the Christian worldview, death and suffering came into the world on account of the fall. But that's not described in moral terms, it's described in causal terms. Because Adam and Eve fell, death and suffering are the consequence of that. Now, in order to give a full account of this, we'd have to understand just what death and suffering are, according to the Christian worldview, and I can hardly be expected to do that in the course of a few minutes. Suffice it to say that by the Christian view, they're not regarded as the evils that they might be regarded as by a non-Christian perspective. They are almost even regarded as gifts. To get an idea of why this might be the case, one might ask the following question. Given that human beings so commonly and naturally tend toward things like selfishness and injuring one another in any number of different ways, what would we expect to become of human beings if they were also given immortality? In such a world, could we anticipate any kind of distinction between human beings on the one hand and demons on the other? Might it be that a term limit has been imposed on our lives, and suffering and hardship have been granted to us as a kind of gift, and a way of helping us to avoid still greater evils without at the same time losing our agency and our freedom? Now, of course, Mr. O'Connor's stronger and more fundamental point here concerns not suffering as such, but gratuitous suffering. The suffering of beings who can legitimately be called innocent, or at least who have done nothing outwardly and explicitly to justify the kind of suffering to which they're subjected. And this indeed is a far harder question to answer. It's a question which makes constant appearance in the Bible, and particularly in the Old Testament. It appears to be one of the great gripes of the Old Testament authors. Why do the just suffer and the unjust thrive? Now, interestingly, in that book, the response which is made is constantly to call God to come down and to set things right. How long, O Lord? This is a question which is asked again and again and again. Now, from the point of view of belief in a transcendent creator deity, one can very easily make the argument that any of the ills or the suffering that happen actually have a reason within the cosmic economy. We're not able to see that reason because we're very limited beings. We're not able to see all ends. We're not able to even follow a single chain of consequences out to its final and furthermost point. So it would be absurd of us to judge that being. The atheist, on the other hand, wants to insist upon his right to judge that being, because the atheist proceeds from a fundamental position of atheism, and that's well and good. But I don't think that this can actually be brought as an argument against Christianity, for the very simple reason that Christianity proposes the single, viable, and morally satisfactory resolution to that problem, which is to say, a God who can set things right. A God who can set everything to its right place, who can give to the just what they deserve and can let the unjust go to the destruction that they have chosen for themselves. Barring that kind of deity, then we do indeed live in an indescribably horrendous world, a world which is filled to the utmost with inexplicable and unjustifiable suffering, a truly terrible place. And so it's a strange thing to take Christianity to task for all of these ills when Christianity again proposes the single solution to this problem that makes any kind of moral sense. Now again, I'm not proposing this as an argument in favor of Christianity. I don't consider this to be an argument at all. It's merely to show that this kind of argument against Christianity doesn't, to my mind, have any teeth.
How do you know that God isn't evil instead? Well, because evil is not a thing the way good is. Just like cold is just a lack of heat, and dark is just a lack of light, evil is just a lack of good. And for good to be objective, it needs to come from God. So a God who is objectively evil is logically impossible.
Yeah, sure. If you think that evil is just a privation of good, then I guess there can't exist a maximally evil being. I suppose I'm just unconvinced by that analysis of what good and evil are. But maybe you're convinced of it. I know that it's a popular view. One reason it strikes me as unintuitive is because if I imagine two possible worlds, one in which nothing at all exists, and one in which a bunch of suffering exists, if evil is just a privation of good, then since they both contain no good, we'd have to say that they're about as bad as each other. That might not be correct under this view, I don't know, but it just doesn't seem like a good way to capture what we think is evil about suffering. But anyway, I'm an ethical emotivist, so of course I'm going to understand these terms differently to you.
I think, Mr. O'Connor, you're right to be unsatisfied with this idea of evil as the mere privation of good. I'm unsatisfied with it as well. Now, as far as I can tell, this traces back to the teachings of St. Augustine. But St. Augustine didn't really put the matter in these terms. He rather regarded evil as being a deliberate movement away from the good, which is to say, willful disobedience to, willful violence against the good. And this kind of willful movement necessarily brings with it suffering and death. This suffering and death, incidentally, is not merely a personal thing, it is a cosmic thing. Human beings are meant to be the pinnacle of creation, and so the moral status of the human being cannot help, in the Christian view, but have ramifications for the whole of creation, which is also a fundamental part of Christian theodicy, and a part of the explanation as to why natural disasters occur or innocent beings suffer. But if there is necessarily an element of willfulness involved in evil, then this at least, I think, clarifies your two-world scenario. It's obvious that in the world of great suffering, there's more evil than in the world with nothing at all, because the world of great suffering was necessarily preceded by a deliberate act of evil, a deliberate act and movement away from the good. Whereas in the world of nothing at all, well, that kind of act didn't happen because nothing exists there. So yes, the world of great suffering would be more evil by this understanding, necessarily and logically, than the world in which nothing exists at all. This, of course, is a strictly secondary point, but I hope that this might help at least to elucidate the understanding of the evil as privation idea that has been confusing you.
Can God make a rock he can't lift? Well, you're just asking if God can contradict himself, like can God lie, or can God change, or can God make another God? And the answer to all those things is no. God being all-powerful means he can do anything to things outside himself. It doesn't mean that he can do anything to himself or that he can contradict himself.
Yeah, I think I agree with this explanation. If omnipotence just means the ability to do all logically possible things, then God can be omnipotent even if he can't create a rock too heavy for him to lift. Or a friend of mine puts it like this: yes, God can do all things, but logical contradictions aren't things. They literally have no referent, even conceptually. Still, I think that there are other, better paradoxes. Take this one about omniscience. Does God know all true propositions? Most theists would say yes. But if so, that would mean that whenever he knows a proposition, P, he must also then know the true proposition, God knows that P. But this creates a new true proposition. It's true that God knows that P. But this creates a new true proposition, and so on to infinity. So, if God knows all true propositions, he must know an actually infinite number of things. Many philosophers think that actual infinites are impossible, and so this causes a problem. Okay, we can respond to this by saying that God doesn't think in terms of true propositions, but rather in a single undivided intuition. There might be other responses too, but at any rate, I think a much more interesting paradox than the stone so heavy he can't lift thing.
So I think that this is also a secondary point, and I think Mr. O'Connor agrees with me, but I think that it also brings out some perhaps more interesting material. See, all of these attempts to refute God or to bring out logical paradoxes when it comes to God are missing the fundamental point, which is that when we're speaking of God, we are speaking of a being that we cannot comprehend. This is a being who gave rise to existence as such, to being as such, and therefore exists outside of the realm of existence or of being. All of the categories that we have in our mind are transcended by this deity. Even the categories of existence and non-existence, being and non-being. Our attempt in any way to find logical contradictions in this being or to reduce him to propositions that don't make any sense to us are completely futile in our effort to actually understand what relation they could have to him. Yes, infinity to the human mind is boggling to the point that it's very understandable how a philosopher might say that it can't possibly exist. But with God, we're not dealing with the human mind. It would be arrogant and presumptuous in the extreme to say that because I cannot imagine something, God cannot either. Or because I cannot do something, God cannot either. We simply don't know. And I think that there's a humility which is necessitated by the theist position, which the atheist tends almost instinctively to press back against. See, the atheist really wants to be, in some basic way, the final arbiter of these matters. He wants to submit everything to his reason in order to understand if it makes sense or if it doesn't make sense, and on the basis of that alone, to determine his course in the world. And the problem is that we live in a world in which there are necessarily things that will not make sense to us. And this is true whether you're a theist or an atheist. To my mind, the hypothesis of a creator God is a much more satisfying way of explaining why there are mysteries in the world than the simple atheist position, which is essentially that the world simply exists. There's no way of explaining why it exists. There's no way of explaining what existence is. We are standing on the back of a mystery that we will never be able to penetrate, an enigma which is fundamentally beyond our reckoning. And we can't even explain why or how this is the case. We are living necessarily in a field of blackness. But if we're living necessarily in a field of blackness, it's very difficult to see how we can consider ourselves to be the final arbiters of anything. Because if you cannot understand the whole in its entirety, you cannot understand the part in its entirety.
Why did God let evil exist at all? So he could be glorified in defeating it. Triumph over evil is a greater good than evil having just never existed.
I'm not convinced by this. The way that I've put it before is like this. Martin Luther King is widely considered to be a good man. Why? Because he overcame the evils of racism. Are we glad to find ourselves in a world with racism so that we can have the good of overcoming it? Wouldn't you rather do without the racism and without the need to overcome it? Triumph over evil is only good insofar as it overcomes something evil. Without the evil to start with, the desire to create it just to overcome it seems really strange. It's like saying that we should be very glad of the existence of cancer because without it, we wouldn't have the good of cancer research and chemotherapy. These things are undoubtedly good and they couldn't exist were it not for cancer. Would we invent the latter to permit the glory of the former? It sounds to me like you're saying this is what what God does.
Once again, I have to come down on Mr. O'Connor's side of this question. The idea that God allows evil in order to be able to overcome it, to my mind, verges very strongly on the impious, because it implies necessarily that God, in some measure, wills evil. Now, I can imagine the scriptural verses that might be cited in order to sustain this point of view, but God, by definition, is the good, so the idea of him being able to will evil is a contradiction in terms, if not worse. A much better way of seeing this, to my mind, is to say that God allows evil because he wills freedom.
Well, yeah, there are a lot of denominations, but the things they agree on are a lot more significant than the things they disagree on.
You know, people often say this about different religions altogether. I hear them say things like, all religions really just agree on the main stuff. I think they often underestimate just how different they are. But sure, the existence of denominations is not incompatible with the truth of Christianity. However, I do wonder why God allows so many honest truth seekers to go wrong, to get the wrong interpretation of his words, especially in places where a person's denomination is predictable based on their parents' or community's denomination. But that just takes us back to the divine hiddenness argument from earlier.
So I'd like to stop here for a second and address an argument which Mr. O'Connor does not actually explicitly broach in the course of this particular video of his, but which he does bring up elsewhere. This is the problem of the non-resistant non-believer, which is to say, a person who does not believe in God because he's not been given evidence or any kind of indication adequate to his own mind to convince him to believe, but truly has an open heart about the matter, truly wants to see if God exists. He's reaching out to God with everything that he has, asking God to reveal himself in some measure to this person, and receives only silence in return. Mr. O'Connor makes this point very movingly in the opening remarks to a debate in which he was involved, and I'll leave the video for that down in the description for anyone who wants to watch it. It is definitely worth watching through. And all of these matters once again come back to the question of expectation, what we can or should expect from our God, or from any God, from a God. Now, part of the trouble with this line of questioning, of course, is that we are inevitably coming up against the absolute difference in kind between the human being and the deity. All of us understand, for example, that our children very often won't understand the reasons for which we do things, and yet we do these things anyway because we have a broader comprehension of the world than our child can have. There's a similar and still more exaggerated difference between a human being and his pet dog, for example. When I tell my dog to do something, I don't have any expectation that my dog will understand why I want him to do that, but he'd better well do it. Now, when we're talking about the relationship between God and the human being, we're talking about a still more inscrutable difference, because we're discussing a deity who exists beyond all of the various categories of our experience, including things as simple as our reasoning capabilities, the time in which we live our lives, the material and spatial world that surrounds us. Trying to understand how God's experience of the cosmos differs from our own is already implying too much in the very use of the word experience, which imports a number of concepts and baggage into this question that we really have no right to import into it. Now, there are a couple of different difficulties involved in this problem of the non-resistant non-believer. The first has to do simply with justice. In a number of Mr. O'Connor's remarks on this question, he goes so far as to state, almost as a premise, that if a person opens his heart to God and attempts legitimately and genuinely to ask for God to reveal himself, then a loving God would do so. And I think that's a fair premise, but of course the question is when and how. And that's not brought out in the premise. Indeed, in order to take this non-resistant, non-believer argument to its really full fruition, I think that you would have to actually claim that we're talking about a person who has striven to do this over the course of a lifetime and has not received any response even at the time of his death. Can we actually make that kind of a claim, however? We don't know anything about what passes through this individual's mind in the very last instance of his life. I mean, if he were given a revolution at the very end of his life which showed him the reality of the deity that he has been seeking, would that satisfy this argument? Or is the argument rather that God has to make appearance somewhere before then? And if so, when precisely? And why at that moment rather than another? I mean, is it simply the very moment that the non-resisting non-believer opens his heart for the first time? These are all expectations that are overlain onto God, and it's very difficult to understand the standards by which these expectations can be put upon him. Now, of course, in its final form, this argument supposes as well that this non-resistant non-believer not only has sought God and failed to find him, but that he's damned for failing to find him. Right, so this is the issue of salvation that comes into this question, largely on account of statements by admittedly Christian groups. Christians who are content to say that these kinds of individuals will be sent to hell and these kinds of individuals will not be sent to hell because they know. Now, obviously, what I'm about to say is not going to satisfy any atheist, but I feel compelled to say it anyway. From my point of view, any attempt whatsoever to make any claim whatsoever about who is saved and who is not saved unless God himself tells us, is unacceptable and presumptuous to the highest. We are literally putting ourselves in the place of God. We do not know the human heart. We cannot know the human heart. We can barely even know our own, and we have some, at least immediate insight into that organ. We don't know what goes on in any individual human breast or in any individual human head. The judgments that we make and must make in this world are of course premised on the things that we do know, the actions of the human being, the fruit that they bear in the world, etc., etc. But as for the final judgment about the status of a human soul, who are we to say anything at all about that? And if I can just say a word to my fellow Christians, I think that we do irreparable harm to our faith and to our testimony of our faith the moment we begin to make any kind of statement, any kind of positive statement, about what individuals will be damned and on what grounds. We can and must point to the kinds of actions which are indicated in the Bible as leading to damnation. But that is a very different thing from saying that such and such a person is going to be damned because of anything that they've done or haven't done. Now, I don't suppose that any of this is going to help Mr. O'Connor with his particular dilemma, but I would ask him to reflect very carefully on just what he means when he speaks of expecting things of God. Supposing for a moment that God does exist, who are you, Mr. O'Connor, to expect anything of him at all? I don't consider this to stand in contradiction to the Christian tradition that God is a God of love. Parents love their children, and they do things that their children regard as being cruel in the highest because their children simply cannot understand. But one day their children will understand. I, as a Christian, believe that we too will one day understand the tribulations to which we've been subjected. And I have some evidence for that in my own life, which is satisfying at least to me personally. When I look back on the trials that I have faced, the suffering that I have gone through, I can see the ways in which it has improved me as a human being and the ways in which it has rounded off my consciousness of the world. My faith, my trust in God is that this contingent and limited earthly experience of ours will, in the same way, one day receive elucidation. Again, I don't expect this to convince anyone. I will at least go this far. I believe that the Christian faith is the only one, at least the only one that I have any awareness of, that can lead a person to that kind of faith.
You really think God made billions of galaxies with billions of stars in each of them just to have a personal relationship with you? Yes.
That's sweet, of course, but sounds a little, I don't know, wishful?
There's a reason, Mr. O'Connor, for which hope is considered one of the primary virtues of the Christian. This faith did indeed come into the world bringing absolutely extraordinary promises that defied all the expectations of the time in which it occurred. So with that, I'll bring this video to a close. I do want to make just a couple of remarks as I leave off about the nature of the conversation between theists and atheists, or more specifically between Christians and atheists. It's very difficult to see exactly on what grounds such conversations are to be carried out. It really does often seem that Christians and atheists stand so far away from one another that it's as if they were standing on two continents divided by a great chasm. One thing at least is clear. In the dispute widely understood between theists and atheists, one or the other is right about the world. Which is to say, either there is a God or there are many gods, on the one hand, or there are no deities, on the other. But there is only a single thing which I believe will put us all in the wrong, and that is failing to meet one another in sincere and genuine conversation to try to understand one another's perspective, as well as we're able, within the limitations of our own. This is one of the things that I truly and sincerely appreciate about Alex O'Connor. I honestly believe that he has this genuine intention. I sincerely salute him for it, because I believe it is becoming vanishingly rare in our times. And it is, I believe, one of the few things that can stop our times from descending into an increasingly wide spiral of chaos and destruction. Now, in the spirit of wishful thinking, I will extend an invitation to Alex O'Connor to continue this particular conversation. I doubt these words will ever find their way to him, but I think it might be interesting for the very simple reason that in this particular debate, we have a certain advantage, he and I. See, I'm a former atheist who made his way over the course of many years and a great deal of soul-searching into Christianity. And Mr. O'Connor is a former Christian who made his way over many years and a great deal of soul-searching into atheism. We have seen and tried to understand one another's point of view, not only from the outside, but from the inside. And I think that this might lead to particularly valuable fruits in any ongoing conversation with us. So I will leave off by casting into the void of the internet that very sincere invitation to you, Mr. O'Connor. However that may be, I greatly enjoy Mr. O'Connor's material, and I will encourage my viewers to take a look at his channel. The link is down in the description. With that, thank you all for joining me for this, and I hope that you've gotten something out of it. If any of you have any thoughts about Redeemed Zoomer's arguments, or Mr. O'Connor's counter-arguments, or my counter-arguments, then by all means, leave them down in the comment section, and one way or another, let's keep the conversation rolling here. With that, I hope that you all find yourself in cooler environs than I presently do, and thank you all again, and farewell.